Hello and welcome to episode 2 of the PUDcast, the Lewis County PUDcast. Yes, the pun is intended there. And today I'm very excited to have WPUDA Executive Director Liz Anderson with me. Thank you so much for joining me.
Daniel, it's great to be here. Looking forward to having a little discussion about PUDs.
Yeah, this is something that I'm really excited about, taking a bit of a deeper dive into what is a PUD that really I haven't been able to do very much. You know, we try and get things out on social media or in newsletters, stuff like that about what public power is, but it's so much more than what you can kind of put in one meme or one image or one little post on Twitter. And so I'm really excited to learn more from you about what all public power is, but also take this chance to hopefully, 100 people, 200 people, somebody gets to listen to this and really take the nerdy deep dive with us of what public power is.
Yeah, well, I'm a history buff anyway, and so I really love talking about the history of public utility districts because we're so unique, and I love our history. I had the opportunity, I actually came from a PUD, I worked at Grays Harbor PUD, and I had the opportunity to work for a commissioner who was on the board for 30 years, and he was a policy expert. He knew everything about policy, so we'd sit around and we'd talk about policy, and inevitably he'd start getting worked up, and he'd start like pounding his fist on the desk and saying, protecting public power isn't about sitting around in a room holding hands singing Kumbaya. It's a street fight. It's a street fight. And I love that because it really reflected on the history of public utility districts. There wasn't a PUD in the state of Washington that was formed in the marbled halls of the Ledge Building in Olympia. We were the result of people rising up who were sick and tired of being sick and tired and decided we're going to do something about it and made a huge change in the state of Washington. And I don't think people really realize how significant PUDs are to the landscape that we have today in the state of Washington. So we have a really fascinating history, and I'm excited to do a deeper dive into it.
What a perfect intro to what we're going to be talking about today. If you're not excited to listen to this after that, then I don't know what you get excited about. First of all, though, introduce yourself a little bit more. Tell us about who you are and how you got involved with public power and got to where you are today.
Yeah, so I am a PUD customer, and I live out in Grays Harbor. The Washington PUD Association office is located in Olympia, so I do that drive every day. And so I really knew about PUDs, but it wasn't really until I went to work for Grays Harbor PUD that I had a good understanding of the real value that PUDs provide. And just a quick little sidebar story, I started at Grays Harbor PUD as their Communications and Government Relations Director, and I started 45 days before the worst windstorm since the Columbus Day storm hit the coast of Washington. So we had hurricane force winds, and that storm parked over Grays Harbor. At the worst point, we had over 90% of the system laying on the ground. And I remember the operations manager, he used to live in Florida, and he went out to survey the damage, and he came in and he said, this is what it looks like when a hurricane hits.
Wow.
And at that time, I realized the value of public power because I had never seen in my entire career a group of people so laser focused on getting one job done, and that was getting the lights back on. And people would just throw out their job descriptions. I remember our CFO, our Chief Financial Officer, cooking food on grills for the crews and the employees. We didn't have power in the administration building. And people just putting aside their job descriptions, foregoing sleep, went without showers for a long time. In fact, kind of the joke was, the first person who's able to get a shower and come back is going to have a rude awakening. But that pace, that dedication was sustained throughout the entire process of restoring power till the last person was back on. And I think that's not unusual for public utility districts. And it's because at the core of who we are is service, right? We're all about serving our communities, and that means our friends, our neighbors, the people we see in the grocery store, the people that are at the Little League Park with us. And it's part of our DNA. It's always been part of our DNA. So that was my big introduction to public utility districts. And then I had an opportunity to move on to the Washington PUD Association. I had been involved in the association as a representative of Grays Harbor PUD, but I really was looking forward to working with all the PUDs in the state of Washington, and that gave me an opportunity to do that. So I moved into a position as government relations and communications director for the association, eventually became deputy director, and then just had the great honor of being named executive director effective the 1st of this year. So I'm in my 7th month as executive director and truly enjoying the work that I do and feel very privileged to be able to do the work that I do.
I think that storm, was that in 2007, the one that you're talking about?
December 2nd, 2007.
Yeah, and that caused a ton of flooding down this way here in Lewis County. That impacted a ton of people as well. So I think a lot of people remember that storm that you're talking about. It definitely was a big impact on my life as well. And I think you're right. As being here at the Lewis County PUD, realizing how much people care about their communities when storms hit, people really jump into action, and you see their best serving their communities, trying to get people's power back on.
And we see that across the state. I don't think there's a PUD that wouldn't do the same or hasn't done the same. And the threats to systems, the threats to service are different across the state. But I have seen just heroic efforts in Eastern Washington in response to wildfires and making sure that the power is back on and broadband is reestablished, and these crews working in what looks like a moonscape. It's just charred and working to get the power back on. It's always a focus on service and making sure that we're providing reliable service and affordable service for our communities, because that's really what we're all about. But it was a fight to get PUDs established. It wasn't an easy process, and there were a lot of key figures historically who were pivotal in the PUD movement, which really began in the late 1920s.
Performing my segue for me. I appreciate that. As we start on the foundation of public power, let's get into how and why public power got started. How did PUDs get going here in Washington State?
You know, it's always about need, right? It's about we have a need and it's not being fulfilled. And that's what was happening in rural Washington in the 1920s. Only about 12% of the farms had access to electricity.
Wow.
And even if you had access, if you had poles and wires running down the road by your farm, the cost of that electricity was so high that you might be able to light a light bulb, and that would be it. You certainly wouldn't try to cook with electricity. You wouldn't heat your home with electricity. There's a great historic advertisement from a private utility that was providing service in a rural area. And the private utilities, they're for profit, and they really didn't have a profit motive to run infrastructure out to rural areas. So they're advertising this kilowatt hour rate, which is in 1921 was 7 cents a kilowatt hour.
Whoa.
So that's not too far off what we are all paying today in public utility districts. And they were advertising this rate. There's a great story about a prominent doctor who bought an electric cook stove in one of these areas served by a private utility. He never used it because he couldn't afford the electricity. So there was a huge amount of frustration in rural areas about the lack of access to affordable electricity. Now, earlier, municipal utilities began to form. So utilities like Seattle City Light, Tacoma Power, Ellensburg was actually the first one to form. And this really gave an example in rural areas of the value of having a public utility. So that was an inspiration for rural areas. Everything kind of came to a head in the 1920s when there was a man by the name of Homer T. Bone. And Homer T. Bone is known as the father of public power. He was a self-taught attorney. He worked for Tacoma Power, and he decided to run for the legislature. So he ran for the legislature, won the seat. And one of his bills that he introduced was a bill that would allow a municipal utility like Tacoma Power to sell power to adjacent small mutual or cooperative utilities without any tax liability. So taxes wouldn't be charged on that. The private utilities wanted no part of public power gaining control in Washington state. And so they killed his bill. Now, if there's one person you don't want to make mad, it's Homer T. Bone. So Homer T. Bone was none too happy about that. And he went to the Washington State Grange. And he told the Grange what happened. And they were so incensed that not only did they endorse the Bone bill, but they passed a resolution in support of this idea of public utility districts. That's really the first time PUDs appeared, this idea. And in the late 1920s, the Washington State Grange decided, okay, we're going to take action. We're going to do something about this. And so they decided to run an initiative campaign. Now, in Washington State, as you know, we have two different ways to do that. There's an initiative to the legislature, and then there's an initiative to the citizens. And with an initiative to the legislature, it goes to the legislature first, and the legislature has an opportunity to act on that. If they don't act on it, or if they reject it, it goes to the ballot in its original form. So they were able to gather twice the number of signatures necessary to advance this initiative that would allow communities to form public utility districts. When it went to the legislature, the House decided we're not going to touch it. The Senate actually voted it down. So that meant the initiative went to the ballot. And there was something else that was going on at the time that really helped support the PUD initiative campaign. And it was this idea of building a large public project at the Great Grand Coulee Dam. The private utilities did not want that to happen.
Interesting.
They proposed an alternative project at Kettle Falls, which would have prevented the construction of Grand Coulee Dam. So the people in Eastern Washington who were proponents of Grand Coulee Dam were very unhappy with private power in Washington state. And so they actually supported the PUD campaign. It wasn't necessarily that they wanted PUDs, but they just were angry at private utilities. So they joined the proponents of the PUD campaign, and the initiative passed with 54% of the vote. That was just the beginning. That put in place the laws of the PUDs, which is RCW 54 today, and that allowed communities to form public utility districts. But that was just the start, because in order to do that, you had to have a local ballot measure that voters approved before a PUD could be formed. Those were very contentious elections, and private utilities worked very hard to defeat the local measures. They ran all sorts of advertising that raised issues about what PUD commissioners could do and what could these three people do, and some scare tactics about public utility districts. But eventually, public utility districts began to form. And the first one to go into operation was Mason County PUD number 1. They're very proud of it. They're proud to be the first. And then most of the PUDs were formed in the 1930s. If you look at the dates when PUDs were formed, a lot of them were in 1936, and that's because something very significant happened at that time. There was a constitutional challenge to the PUD law. The Washington State Grange fought to preserve the law. They were victorious. Now the door was open to form PUDs. There wasn't any legal barrier to doing that. And so a lot of them were formed in 1936. That was also when the Washington PUD Association was formed. It wasn't called the PUD Association at the time. What happened is the Grange master, the head of the Washington State Grange, called together the elected commissioners of the existing PUDs to a meeting in Seattle, and basically said something to the effect of, we managed to do this very significant thing and allow for formation of public utility districts. Now we need your leadership as elected commissioners to support formation of public utility districts. And that was the beginning of the Washington PUD Commissioners Association, which later on in the 1950s became the Washington PUD Association.
You mentioned in kind of your introduction when we were talking before how it's a street fight. Your former commissioner said this is a street fight. And it seems like throughout that history, there's a lot of battles that had to take place to get this formed. And if you look at some of the political advertising back in the 30s, you can only imagine how intense that is. And we probably don't have time at the moment, but people should go look up political advertising in the 30s. It got intense.
Yes, and it's interesting because I've been over at the Washington State Grange office, and they have these great archives of all their newsletters, and they were pretty aggressive with their campaign advertising as well. There's just some great examples with this big, it looks like a monster, like a giant dinosaur dragon. It's dragon, and it's got written on the side, Power Trust Monopoly, and then there's a man standing there, and he's standing tall, and he's got a sword in his hand, and this large sword, and it says initiative, number one. So yeah, it was a very contentious time. And by the way, that was the very first initiative to the legislature.
Yeah, and
so
we're in the 2000s now, as there's some initiatives on the ballot this year, but initiative number one started with public power, and I think what an awesome piece of trivia that is, working in public power to have that bragging rights right there.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive, and again, in the state archives, there's some really great documents from, the Secretary of State, and there's a telegram informing the Grange that the Senate voted down the initiative. So there's just all this history about our public utility districts, but it really has changed the landscape for the state of Washington because now we have these community-owned, not-for-profit utilities. And there's this thing they call the yardstick effect. And the yardstick effect is when you have private utilities functioning alongside consumer-owned utilities, which are not-for-profit utilities. And what happens is there's a real benefit to the customer because the investor-owned utility has to keep their rates reasonable. And that actually happened in Seattle when Seattle City Light formed. The investor-owned utility that was providing power at that time, their rates dropped. So it benefits the customers.
As we get into fast forward now to present, is that the biggest difference when it comes to a private utility and a public utility? The price? Is it just in operation and that the private ones are trying to get profit for their stakeholders? How does it work?
It's a different business model.
Okay.
And I think the significant difference is that with a public utility district, you have local control. You have a locally elected board of commissioners who are making decisions in the best interest of the community that elected them. And every PUD in the state is different. That really reflects the unique needs of each community. With an investor-owned utility, you're regulated by the Utilities and Transportation Commission, an appointed commission, and those people don't necessarily live in your community. They don't know what your needs are. And if you want to have a say in that process, it happens in Olympia. So it's a very different business model. We are, of course, not-for-profit, investor-owned utilities. They need to make a profit. They have shareholders, and their fiduciary responsibility is to their shareholders. Our responsibility is to people of our community because they're the owners of our utility at the end of the day.
So with that, what gives the public utilities kind of an advantage when it comes to this? Because it's not only that we don't have shareholders, but it does seem like there's some other built-in advantages for public utility districts with how we are able to get power and then provide it to our community members it seems like there's some other built-in things there that help us out.
So significantly, and this is where Homer T. Bone again comes into the picture, back in 1937, the Bonneville Project Act was passed, and that created the Bonneville Power Administration. It stipulated that a new power agency, BPA, would market and transmit power from the federal dams, and here's what's significant, and give preference and priority to the use of electric energy to public bodies and cooperatives. So PUDs, as well as other consumer-owned utilities, have first right to the electricity produced by the federal system at cost. And that is significant. That provision was fought for by Homer T. Bone when he ended up going to Congress.
Has that changed it all over the years?
No, you still have preference.
Wow.
Still have preference rights. And that's something that consumer-owned utilities fight very hard to protect.
So with that, it seems like the importance of the BPA and where they get their power and the federal dams, huge for especially us in Washington State and in the Northwest.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The federal hydropower, it provides a huge amount of electricity, and significantly, the characteristics of that electricity are beneficial. It's renewable and it's relatively low cost. And the federal system enables us to integrate intermittent renewable resources like wind and solar, because it has the ability to ramp up and down. So when the wind is blowing, you can adjust the federal system. When it's not blowing, you can adjust to meet the needs of customers across the region. So that's a huge part of our power resources in the Pacific Northwest and benefits your customers here in Lewis County.
And when you're talking about the resources that we have, it's a really hot topic now as we're looking to the future. Load growth is expected to just keep growing exponentially, it seems like, in the near future. And hydropower, having all of that flexibility is hugely important. But also, how do we sustain that and find other ways to find new generation sources?
Right. You know, it's a huge challenge ahead of us. We have what I sort of call the perfect storm, in that we are moving to a 100% clean electricity grid. We have a state law called the Clean Energy Transformation Act that requires us to achieve that by 2045. Now, the good news is many of our public utility districts already provide very clean energy. However, we have to continue to move forward with that goal. We also have a state energy strategy in place that strives to meet our decarbonization goals through electrification of other sectors like buildings and transportation. Right. So we are anticipating increased use of electricity, so more demand for electricity. The original estimate was that it would double by 2050.
Wow.
But now we have some new information, some new forecasts that are indicating that it's going to ramp up even faster. And I think the latest challenge that you're hearing a lot about also is with AI and the technology needs. That requires electricity. So that's going to put demands on our system as well. So we have the challenge of making sure that we have the resources generating electricity to meet the needs of this increased demand. We have to have the transmission, the lines that will carry that electricity from the point of generation to the end users. And we have to do that in a pretty tight time frame. So we definitely have some challenges ahead of us to work through, especially in the near term as things ramp up.
With how closely our power is tied to the BPA, with that preference and the federal dams that we get the power from, another topic going on right now where you're talking about the lower Snake River dams and the possibility that they're looking at removing some of those. It seems like that could really impact public utilities, maybe even more than privately owned ones as well, as we're all searching for more generation, and now a major source is possibly threatened of coming out, but not only threatened for everybody, but that's one of our preference sources, isn't it, with some of those dams?
Right, right. So the lower Snake River dams, I think the capacity is about 3,800 megawatts. But one of the functions of those dams is to meet needs when energy use is really high. So, for example, when we had the heat dome, remember that? Those dams were running full bore to keep the lights on during that event. When we had a cold snap in January, you might remember that, we were importing power from the southwest because wind was non-existent at that time and solar was almost non-existent. It was the middle of winter. You just don't have that kind of production. So those resources are important to our grid reliability. There has been some significant actions related to the federal system. Most recently, in December of last year, there was a settlement agreement reached over operations of the Columbia River system, and it was to bring to an end litigation over the operation of the system that has been ongoing. That settlement agreement has implications for the entire federal system. It's not just the lower Snake River dams. So it's important to protect fish and wildlife. There are hundreds of millions of dollars that Northwest ratepayers pay into the Bonneville Power Administration to do that. And we want to make sure that we're being good stewards of the environment, but also making sure that we're able to keep the lights on.
Bringing it back towards the local and community side of things. Earlier, you had mentioned that one of the big differences between public power and private power is the local control. And I think you see that in not only having commissioners who know their areas best to serve them, but you mentioned it also with your story at the beginning of the storm that you took part in right after you started in PUDs, just the amount of dedication that people have to those areas. But I think it can also be talked about how we treat our neighbors in need. The more PUDs I talk to and people I talk to who work in different PUDs, it seems like there's always community programs to help out low-income customers and people who might need help with energy assistance. And I think that, again, speaks to the community of public power in that aspect where, for a lot of PUDs, our rates are already at the low-income threshold of some of the private utilities.
Right.
And yet then trying to find ways to help people after that as well.
Right. Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. I think that PUDs are just part of the fabric of their community. They're thinking about everybody in the community. They're thinking about the businesses that are the economic engine of the community, but they're thinking about those people in need, and they're thinking about the service agencies in their community. They're thinking about all those things because, again, there's just this focus on what's going to be best for our community. How do we make sure that we are delivering essential services in a way that meets the unique needs of our community?
On top of that, you not only have the communities of each specific PUD, but it seems like there's a good community of PUDs in general, right? Working together, especially with WPUDA, with your organization. Can you speak to the importance of WPUDA in getting vastly different areas who are served by PUDs pushing in the same direction to try and help out issues that are important to largely different demographics, west side of the state, east side of the state, a lot of different issues that we all deal with, but to have a unified voice like that?
Yeah, when our association changed from the Washington PUD Commissioners Association to the Washington PUD Association, there were services added at that time to promote operational excellence among PUDs. And the idea was if we weren't doing a good job of serving our communities, that would really open the door for critics of PUDs to come in and try to undermine our authorities or make it difficult to deliver those services. So we had to do a good job. And with that in mind, we brought together PUDs to share information, to receive training. We're very good at admiring and acquiring. So when one PUD has a best practice that works well, they'll share it with the rest of the PUDs. We do that at the association to make sure that we're not reinventing the wheel. And when we are doing things, we're making decisions with a good amount of information information and some perhaps real world experience from other PUDs that will inform our decisions. So we work together to provide that kind of service foundation and training and education, but we also work to see where do we have common issues and how can we work together to advocate at the state level or the federal level very efficiently to address challenges or to be able to take advantage of opportunities that would benefit our communities as well. So it's just a really efficient way for PUDs to come together, to work together, to support each other, and by doing that we make the entire PUD community stronger.
Another thing that popped into my head as you were talking about that and reinventing the wheel and the new things and how we work together, thinking back to how PUDs got started, it almost seems like we are kind of hitting a new era of need and filling a need with broadband. With what's going on in trying to get service out to rural areas, it almost seems like the start of PUDs with getting electricity out to the rural areas. It seems like we're starting that whole cycle up again.
It's so many similarities between electricity and broadband. And we had, as public utility districts, wholesale authority that was put in place in 2000, and that was intended to be able to bridge the digital divide. But we didn't have retail authority. And I think the landscape really changed because of COVID. When COVID hit, there was the reality that people didn't have access to broadband, and we had work to do. We had people who were traveling to Wi-Fi hotspots so their kids could connect and attend class. I have a great picture of a dad who took his daughter to a Wi-Fi hotspot and created a cardboard desk for her in the back of his SUV so she could attend class.
Wow.
Well, looking at that, that's not the best way
Right.
to connect our children to education. And so with COVID and a recognition that we have work to do in this area, I think that was really the catalyst for legislation that gave PUDs, retail authority, another pathway to be able to get service so we could start addressing that issue and hopefully get everybody connected. So now we have a huge amount of federal dollars coming into the state of Washington, $1.2 billion, and the focus will be on building out those networks to be able to provide access to unserved and underserved areas, which I know you're working on.
Yeah, absolutely. We got projects going on here that we're very excited about. And yeah, I think that about covers most of the things that I had on my mind to talk about. So unless you have something else that popped up into your head that maybe you want to touch on a little bit, I think that's about it that we have for today.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. This was fun to be able to talk a little bit about the history of public utility districts. And Lewis County PUD is a great PUD and a big part of our public utility district family. So we appreciate the contributions you make to the association, your participation, and just think you have a great community here. So happy to be here and have the opportunity to talk to you.
Again, Liz Anderson, Executive Director of the Washington PUD Association. Thank you again so much for joining me.
Thank you.